skip forward to modern day, and we will address the fundamentals of our current resource allocation. And it is a resource, as Ms. Morgan pointed out, we have kind of a blended version of a resource allocation method with programs. So it is unique, as she pointed out, and we'll talk about why during this time. I'm also, as we're going through those funding formulas, and as you get understand individual allocations, how they are up, but also how they work together to make one system, going to align with systems that are in the remedial plan, the CRP. So you can see kind of the bits that are highlighted in that and where there are actions proposed. What we are not going to address today are the following. This is kind of the exceptions, the 10% exceptions that do actually take up a lot of our time. A lot of times we're talking about this 10%. Last month I discussed about the charter school funding and how the budget, it really needs to be reevaluated as to how we go about with that. We're going to leave that aside, fun topic, but we're going to focus on the 90%. And we do have to remember that with our funding, the state does have 64%, which is what I'm going to focus on today. It is unusual. We have an unusually high percentage of state funding. A lot of reasons of all that history that I have passed through and chosen not to discuss, but it is, the average is actually less than 50% for state funding. We are in the top 10 of states by the percentage that is state funded. There is, there's influence with that percentage, right? So the state does have a lot of ability to change that funding with such a high percentage of it. Just going through the other pieces briefly. Local budgets, North Carolina, these local boards of education, which is also kind of unusual, do not have tax authority. So that is a very important aspect to understand with regards to our local boards of education. The funds that they are appropriated are very flexible, and if they are unspent, they can carry forward to the next year. So it's kind of their spending bucket. There is a large variance in the amount of their per pupil expenditure from local funds. And you can see here the lowest to the highest. Some of that disparity is balanced by state and federal funds, but does not make everyone up to the highest for sure. The highest, when you're looking there, a lot of those districts have supplemental taxes. So that is, you can see where the average is. It's a lot closer to the lowest than it is the highest. On the federal side, we have U.S. Department of Ed as well as USDA with the school nutrition. The Department of Ed, was just over $1 billion that we received through them, and then we spend a lot of time talking about those grants. And then the USDA, it's about $500 million coming through school nutrition. And those are the largest. An important thing to remember with our federal grants is that they are supplemental and they are targeted to specific populations of students. They are not, they also come with a lot of administration and requirements, compliance requirements. So when we're looking at our state allotments, we have our general statute and our session law that is given to us by our General Assembly, and then the State Board of Education policy. I have come probably, you think, too frequently to the State Board, getting approval for modifications to Allot 003, which is our allotment policy manual. The State Board provides kind of a broader the broader aspects to those appropriation lines, as well as, providing us the authority to actually disperse the funds. Before I go any further, I do want to kind of say we could actually have like a funding palooza for about 3 days talking about different aspects of public school funding. We could take it from the perspective of how we build the state public school fund budget, like at the appropriations level and that aspect. We could look at how we disperse the funds, which is kind of what we're going to focus on today, how how we determine what Wake County gets as opposed to Clay County. Or we could be looking at how the school districts utilize those funds and how they expend them. Those are three different, it's the same money, but it's three different perspectives of looking at those funds. And I want you just to keep that in mind, because often people get those things kind of, they want to make them the same and they are not. So I won't go on any more on that, but just wanted to bring that up. We do have 5 different types of allocations, and you can see them here. The grants at the bottom, I am not going to really be talking about today. It's a relatively new phenomenon in North Carolina to have state grants, like school resource officer grants for elementary and middle school. We have the mobile coding grants. We have the expansion of CTE in the grades, those kind of things. Those are kind of very modern era, but they also make up like less than 1% of the state public school funds. So we're not going to discuss those today. What we are going to look at is really at those the bottom line there, the base, the positions and the dollars. Which are generated by all of our public school students. They kind of are all in those formulas and generate that base. And then going into the supplemental categorical allotments, when those are the ones that get the most attention, because they are focusing on different characteristics in our student population, as well as the different demographics of our school districts. And you can see here that categorical, or the one, I hate to say that that's kind of where the weighting is, because we actually have some fairly subtle but significant weighting also with our position allotments. But it is 23% is our categorical allotments, and then the other 2 kind of is that base. We have 54 different state PRCs currently. This has been brought to attention when we had the Program Evaluation Division did a significant review of our allocation, all our allocations back in, I think it was 2016, I believe. And some of those are different appropriation lines and some of them are accounting functions. I'm not going to go through all of them, right? So we're going to focus on these 14 here, which make up about 95% of our of the state appropriations. You'll see on the left-hand side, that's where those the base positions, dollars, and the guaranteed. And then on the right-hand side are those supplemental categorical allotments. One of the ones I'm not going to go into today is transportation, but I want to bring that up, that it is a categorical allotment. We don't fund every school district the same amount per ADM for busing. It is, needless to say, more expensive when you have a rural, your population is dispersed, it's mountainous, it's going to cost more per student than it would in a dense urban area. So that's pretty much all I'm going to say on that. I'm actually not really qualified to talk about the efficiency formula and all the other things that go into that allocation anyway. All right, let's dive into our position allotments. This is a North Carolina thing. It is not in other states. It is that back in 2000, I think it was actually 2018, there was a joint legislative task force on finance reform that met, and they were tasked through legislation. There was 9 senators and 9 House members that heard from the Program Evaluation Division, looked at their report. They listened to LEAs, representatives from LEAs, from charter schools, from the department, as well as, School Boards Association and researchers. One thing that came very clear from the LEA standpoint is that this is something they really like. They like the position allotments. And the reason I say that is because a lot of people outside of the school districts consider this as an inequitable way to allocate out funds, because it does the funding is associated with the average salary of the people, the educators that people can employ in those positions. And you'll see that as we get through into these position allotments. So how does it work? The legislature determines the formulas. They're going to determine how many positions of each one of these certified educator position categories the school district that are going to be funded, right? And they determine how it's going to be dispersed. They also determine the salary schedule that is required to be used at a minimum in the school districts. What the school districts do is they get to recruit the most qualified individual that they can find to fit that position. So instead of saying, oh, here you've got, $50,000 to find a position with your salary and benefits, we say, you know what, you've got a 10-month position, go find that individual to fill that role. And if you find a beginning teacher at $35,000 a year, we will cover it. If you find a teacher with 30 years of experience, nationally board certified, and they are paid $20,000 more, we will cover it, we being the state. And that is how that works. There are, with teachers, they are, the assignment is determined by the school district. So if it's a math teacher or social studies, what grade they are in, they will determine that. But they must be in compliance with the K-3 class size. So that is something that is mandated. From the DPI standpoint, we manage all the 70,000 teacher salaries and make sure that it is within our budget, which thankfully we have done. So that's good. So all those salaries and benefits we cover, and then we charge them 4 months of employment. And that's how that works. So what is stopping a school district from paying a teacher $100,000? Well, every month, we collect every payroll check from every individual out in the school district. We compile it into the department, and we audit that individual to make sure that we look at their license, we look at their education, whether they're nationally board certified, and actually what type of license. So we make sure that they are paid, if they have paid out of EC funds, that they actually have an EC license. And so we match that with what the school district has paid with what they should be paid. And if they don't, if there is not a match, then an audit exception is created and they have to refund. So that's how we manage it and we make sure. So, and the reason I go into that detail is because you can't have position allotments without a salary schedule. You have to have a control in place, right? So, so here's the rationale, just in summary, is it does give all LEAs the same ability to pay a teacher, regardless of their local circumstance. As I said before, some see this as an inequity. I think, and Dare County was pointed as, well, Dare County receives more per teacher than, a county that struggles recruiting. That is a true statement in theory. And the reason being that Dare County so happens to be rather an attractive place to live, and they attract some very veteran teachers out there. And so their average years of experience is high, and so the cost is high. Whereas in another area which is hard to recruit, they are seeing a higher turnover. There is a very strong correlation between the average salary in a school district and their turnover rate. And there is a strong correlation with the turnover rate and an ability to recruit teachers to the area. So there needs to be a separation out from how we fund a teacher position and how we fund recruitment initiatives. The other thing is, which is often not stated, is actually out in the West, we have very high retention. So their population of teachers is, they actually have a very high average salary also. And so having these position allotments, they don't have to worry each year that their salary increase, their salary costs are increasing each year because we are going to guarantee those salaries. And here's just a summary of kind of the money we're talking about. You can see that $6.7 billion is associated with those positions and the benefits. Principals, how do we fund them? How do we allocate them, rather? Every recognized school in the state receives one 12-month position. It could be a school of 200 or it could be a school of 3,000, and we have both. As long as they have a minimum of 100 average daily membership, they receive that one position. This obviously favors or does not disadvantage rural areas that tend to have small schools. So in your comprehensive remedial plan, there is no action recommended on this item. Assistant principals, we heard yesterday how critical it is to have both an instructional leader as well as an operational leader. Our assistant principals are critical, and you can see this from the data that from the state's perspective with position allotments, you have to have almost a school of 1,000 to generate one assistant principal. School districts, you can see that they value these assistant principals because there is probably an additional 40% assistant principals that are funded out of categorical allotments, meaning our at-risk allotments, some of the other allocations that permit an assistant principal to be funded out of. There is also, out of the total assistant principals, about 30% are funded from federal and local funds. So this is an area that school districts definitely appreciate having those personnel, those leadership positions in their schools. The comprehensive remedial plan, the action is to make that 1 to 80 average daily membership, and that was actually bringing it back to the 2011 level. Our instructional support positions, this is, again, only the position allotments. We have a lot of personnel, certified personnel, that are funded out of our categorical allotments. But for the position allotments, there is one 10-month position for every 210 average daily membership. So if you have a school of 1,000, it generates just over 4.5 positions. The school district determines how they want to use those positions, right? They determine if they need school counselors, media coordinators, nurses, etc. Some of these positions are like school psychologists, school audiologists, speech language pathologists. Those positions are often funded by the school district out of exceptional children funds. So they are technically in this instructional support category, but they are heavily funded by those categorical allotments for the students that they support. Just to see here that we did have a 5% increase in this funding category back in 2020, but we are still short of the 2009 ratio of 1 to 200. In your CRP, this is the recommendation for the action, is to have these 5 categories of employees to be funded at these various ratios, which going back, if you have all of them at one 10-month position at 210 ADM, and then the proposal is for what you see here, you can see that it is a significant increase in the support for those positions. And then we do have our classroom teacher and program enhancement teachers. These are funded based on a one 10-month position for every average daily membership, number of average daily membership you can see in that second column. So for instance, there is one 10-month position is generated by every 16 average daily membership in first grade. One kindergarten teacher for every 18 ADM. For all of these do create a pool that 75,000 teachers that generate that pool at the state level, and then obviously at the LEA level, they generate a pool. School districts do not have to use any of these teachers for these grades as stipulated, but for K3, there is class size maximums. So they do have to make sure that those classes are do not exceed what that allotment ratio is. The program enhancement allotment is new. It is actually in its 4th year. It was funded at 25% each of the years from 2018-19. And so this year is its first year of fully funding. And part of your CRP, the action was to get this fully funded. And so that one has been completed. There is also teacher positions for career technical education that I have not put on here. And those are specific to that program, and they are restricted to use for CTE. They are funded at a minimum of 5 positions per LEA and then per ADM for grades 8 through 12 on top of that. And I did not include that in here. Guaranteed allotments. When we use the term guaranteed allotments, usually what that means is that we don't actually allot the money out to the school districts. We are, at the department, we are managing the budget at that level. The items that are included in this are annual leave payout, longevity, short-term disability. These are kind of the guaranteed benefits for the state employees. And so it'd be very difficult for us to anticipate and allocate the exact amount out to the school district. So they basically charge the state for those benefits, and then we cover the costs, and then it is done through an audit process to make sure that they are appropriate costs. But it is important to know that they are not, these funds are not distributed out on an per average daily membership basis, right? They are not student generated. Over 90% of the state funds are expended on salary and benefits, and it's not really surprising, right? We are a very human resource industry. We need humans to instruct. As much as we would love to say that a device can do that, or we have self-driving school buses, we are not there yet. We need humans to instruct, to clean the buildings, to drive the buses, to make the lunches. So I think it's important to have this segment on our salary and benefits to illustrate the impact that salaries have on our budget. This graph here, the bars show the appropriations since 2005 or 6. And you will see there during the Great Recession years that there is a significant decline. You kind of have to take those out of the equation because there was a significant amount of federal money that kind of filled that gap, stabilization money during that. But even with that, you can see that there was a decline, and now we have increased our appropriations in a greater percentage, even when you take from 2009, than the increase in the average daily membership. So what has been the driver of these appropriation increases? Is it investing more in the resources we have or providing additional resources? And I think that's an important distinction to make. Looking at our salary increases, the increases in salary are a significant driver. You can see here, this is school building administrators. That includes our principals, which are the orange line, and then the assistant principals at the line below. There was a decline in the average. That does not mean that people were making less, but on average, the salaries were declining because there was a freeze in the state salary schedules. And you'll see that also with our teacher and instructional support slide on the next one. With that freeze, where everyone just kind of got bunched at the bottom and there wasn't any progression, that was looked at in, I think, 2016, 2017. There was a restructuring in 2018 of our principal salary schedule, where they went from kind of a step and lane type schedule where they were paid based on their years of experience. They are now paid based on their history of school growth in the school that they supervise, with additional recognition on the size of schools. These average salaries, these are base. These are the base of the state salary schedule. So they do not include the performance bonus or local supplements. And that can be very significant in some of our schools where I mentioned, Charlotte-Mecklenburg has 3 schools, over 3,000 students. They are paying a significant amount in addition to the state base. The size of the school in the state salary schedule for principals tops out at 1,600 students or more. So there is a big difference between obviously a 1,600 student school versus 3,000 comprehensive high school, right? So, and then there is significant performance pay that has also been implemented, where the top 50% based on school growth of our principals are eligible for a bonus of $1,000 to $15,000, depending on what that growth was. The one thing to also note is that the longevity now for our principals is blended in with the pay. They are not eligible for longevity. When we're looking at the average compensation for state-funded teachers, and this does include local supplement, you can see it's kind of a similar pattern where it declines and then increases. So that decline with the teachers, it not only were the first 5 steps of the teacher salary schedule all paid the same, which was $30,800 as a state base. We also lost a lot of veteran teachers at that time. There was about a 36% decrease in teachers with 30 years or above during that time. I think, where the pay is flat, it might be time where you're thinking, okay, maybe I'm just going to retire. So that also, as we do have a step and lane salary schedule, if it does reflect the average years of experience of our teaching population. And here is kind of less fun things to talk about, because that was fun, right? So meaning where we can talk about our personnel and the salary increases that is going into the pockets of our employees out in the school districts, and it's also going back into our economy. And so it is definitely a positive investment. When we're looking at our benefits associated with state employees, you can see here the significant increase in our health and retirement rate that is that has to be funded in our budgets, and it does take resources away from other things. So it cannot be ignored, and it is anticipated to continue to increase in the near future, specifically the retirement rate, which is, as you can see, at 21%, arguably way too low back in 2003. When I started in 2002, it was at 3.03%. But even if you look back at 2015, where it was 15%, that difference of the 6% is a significant amount of funding. When you're looking at this from perspective, this is all funds, so it's not the 90%. It's actually, when you consider federal and local funds, you're looking at about 83% is expended on your salaries and benefits. But you can see the total amount on salary and benefits is pretty much constant from year to year. However, the shift between what is being expended on salaries versus benefits is very noticeable. So our other compensations for teachers, and a lot of these are relatively new also. The performance bonuses for teachers in grades 3 through 5 for reading, 4 through 8 for math, as well as our advanced classes and the CTE credential bonuses. We have recruitment bonuses for highly qualified teachers that school districts can pay them an extra step or 3 steps, depending on the school that they work in. Advanced teaching roles are for select LEAs at this point, but a growing program. And then, although a while back, the state would pay for the cost of the exam of a national board, that is no longer a benefit, but it does support the teachers with 3 days of educational leave. So that also is a benefit that they receive. For principals, we have As I said, the performance bonus. We also have a recruitment bonus for highly qualified principals who work in low-performing schools, and that is $30,000 a year, up to 3 years. It is a significant, well, in my opinion, it's a significant amount of money. I will say, and I was actually talking to Dr. Emery about this yesterday, it has been unusual, a bit of a concern that we have not filled all of, I think we have 40 positions that we can fill, and we do not have half of those taken up at this point. As much as Dr. Emery and I have worked very closely together, because she has people out in the field to really explain to them what a recruiting tool this can be and to get people in there, it has just been a bit of an unusual struggle. So in your CRP, there is a desire to get North Carolina to be competitive in the region and the nation. I will say we are second as of 2021. We are second in the Southeast. Georgia is above us. We have just over $54,000 is our total compensation. That does not include benefits. Georgia is at $60,005, but the average for the Southeast is $52,000. So we are definitely in a much better place than we were back in 2013-14. There is also in the CRP, there is a focus on professional development, mentor programs that, and I put this here just as information because for historical purposes, in 2009, we did have some, not a huge amount of funding for the programs you see there, but there was additional funding available for those things. Dollar allotments. Okay, so dollar allotments is literally dollars per ADM. You have so many students, you get a specific amount per student. When we're looking at classroom materials, it's currently at $30 per ADM, and then textbooks at $32. The CRP the action is to combine these allotments into one and to fund it at $150 per average day membership. With regards to non-instructional support, it is funded at, those are your clerical, custodians, those kind of personnel. They are not directly involved in the instruction of students. It's currently funded at $274 per student, and the CRP recommends increasing that funding. For teacher assistants, historically, this was always $1 per student, right? But I should say dollars per K3 student. And then back in 2015, it was changed. The funding formula was changed to kind of more of a, almost like a position allotment without positions. And so it is confusing for school districts, this one, when it got changed. And so, anyway, the CRP recommends to go back to that old funding formula of the dollars per student. All right, categorical allotments. These are the ones that are focused on the demographics of the students and the demographics of the school district. You'll see here how it kind of weights out by program, the percentage of the expenditures for each one of these. So the largest of the categorical is going to be your exceptional children, and I can't read, I don't have my glasses on. Oh my God, the orange block. My apologies. And that's not really surprising. We obviously have a lot of focus on our exceptional children students. Categorical allotments, they are restricted to purpose and they are supplemental. Keep in mind that first slide of the triangle. All students generate funds for those base allocations, and then these are in addition to support those programs. So we have a lot of teachers and actually instructional support and assistant principals that are paid out of these categorical allotments. And you can see there in 2021, there were over 14,600 teachers that were paid out of these categorical allotments. So they are a critical support on our instructional programs. This just shows you kind of a breakdown. You know, the children with disabilities, it's closing in on $1 billion. It is not insignificant. And then as a whole, we talked about it was 23%. And you can see there that children with disabilities or exceptional children are the largest. The top 5 are focused on students, the student demographics, right? And then the bottom 3 are really focused on the demographics of that we see in the district itself. This is where all the weighting comes. Not the waiting, but the weighting. Right. Sorry. I know it's like, oh, so bad, so bad. All right. So starting with the largest, right? The exceptional children. There is our current funding formula funds a flat rate amount for every student that has an IEP based on the headcount of the prior year. In concept, it creates a pool of funds for then the school district to take and serve the students and their needs. It is capped at 12.75%. The headcount is capped at 12.75%. This is by legislation of the total average daily membership. That was recently increased from 12.5%. I believe it is the House that is proposing to increase that to 13%. So we will see if that does come in the final budget. That is one point of contention for sure. However, there is no expectation that every student with an IEP would be served with the expenditures of $4,550, right? Some students are a lot less, need a lot less services than other students. So this is kind of an average, arguably an average, but it is a flat rate that then gets all commingled for the school district to determine those programs. There is other funds to recognize that we have some students that need significant, it's very costly, right? So the special state reserve, the school districts can apply to the Office of Exceptional Children and receive a specific funding for specific students. So if there's a student that needs a one-on-one caregiver or very expensive equipment, they can receive those funds for that student. The CRP, it does, the action is to remove the cap. It also is, it states to fund the exceptional children at 2.3 times the cost of the average student. And it states to revise the formula to differentiate based on the level of required student support. There was a task force that spent significant amount of time in analyzing what other states did, the cost of different disabilities and what it costs to provide the service in a compliance with their IEP. And I believe this was in 2015, I'm going to say, somewhere around there. It was a group from the school districts, and a lot of work was done, and those recommendations were provided to the General Assembly. This was one of the things that they worked a significant amount of time on, was to look at that differentiated, the differentiated funding formula. On the academically and intellectually gifted, this is a flat rate. It is not based on a head count. We do not say, okay, well, this school district has, 6% is AIG, this school district has 2%. Everyone is funded at 4% of their average daily membership at a flat rate. That is both the flat rate here and in the exceptional children is legislated. It is in the appropriations bill. There is no action in the CRP related to this allotment category. Limited English proficient. This is a little bit of a difficult one to explain to most people. It's a 50-50 formula, and half of it is based on a 3-year weighted average of the actual headcount of students who have ESL, right? So, and then the other half is based on a concentration. In legislation, it does cap at 10.6% of the average daily membership. And it also states that if you have less, you have to have at least 20 students designated as LEP before being eligible for any funding. So this is not a very popular funding formula. And with the increase in our population in North Carolina, when you're looking back in 2015 and our head count was about 100,000 students, and we are now in 2021, and it is about 125,000 students. We have a significant increase in this demographic of student, and this arguably this funding formula is perhaps not keeping up with the times. The CRP recommends to eliminate that cap, to eliminate the concentration, and to increase the funding. I should have said that when there was that task force on the finance redesign that the General Assembly had, this was one of the things that the school districts were very supportive of. They were very supportive of keeping those position allotments, looking at this limited English proficient formula, as well as the EC, the exceptional children changes. These are the two allocations that are very similar in concept. They are our disadvantaged students and our students that are at risk. There is a difference, but really in practice, they become one program to meet the needs of those students. The DSSF funding formula came out in 2004. It was in response to Leandro. And so that funding formula was kind of generated based on kind of attributes of the county, not necessarily the students. So that was, as opposed to the at-risk formula, which is really looking at students in poverty based on census. We do not fund using free and reduced lunch, just had to add that in there. But looking at census data, and then the other half is just based on an average daily membership. You can see here when you're looking at a school district, like if you rank all the school districts and you look at the per ADM amount, you can see that, you know, the higher the poverty of students in your school district, the higher dollars per student you receive. The same thing with the DSSF funding formula. It ranges from $31 per student to $584, depending on those attributes in your county. The CRP recommends the action is to combine those two allotments and then to increase the funding. That is also supported by many because of how similar those allocations are, how similar the use of the funds are. The at-risk also, and I'm not sure I had that on the slide, it does also provide the SRO funding for each high school. But it also is the main source of funding to support alternative schools. They obviously per student are quite costly, and so that's where most school districts are utilizing, getting their funding from. I threw these in just as a bonus, I guess. They are not on the 14, but they, I did think as a categorical allotment, I wanted to put them in because they're kind of targeting achievement, which the first is the summer camps, which is looking at students below grade level. But the other two are really looking at kind of focusing bonuses and recruitment bonuses on those hard to staff schools, and also recognizing teachers who have contributed to significant growth in those students. Now, those were the ones weighted on the student demographics. Here are the ones weighted on the LEA demographics. Low-well supplemental funding. Ms. Morgan was talking about the calculating the local share. Our General Assembly doesn't really do that per se. However, one could argue that looking at the low-well supplemental funding, they are providing funding based on a school district's ability to generate property tax revenues from that, as well as the per capita income. So those were two aspects that she mentioned in her presentation. These funds are really to compensate for districts and counties that do not have as high local funding as others. So if you are below the state average in your ability to generate those local funds, you are eligible to receive a portion of the low wealth supplemental funding. When we're looking at this funding over time, you'll see that it was actually in 2006, 16, or well, 2006. 2006, it was fully funded. And you can see where the increase in this low wealth funding formula is now. It's at $268 million. There are 78 LEAs that receive this, 76 LEAs that receive this, and that includes city districts. And it is only those ones that are below the state average that are eligible. The further you are from the state average, the more funds you receive per student. So up at the top there, you can see that school district, which happens to be Robeson County, receives $877 per student, whereas at the bottom, they are very close to the state average, so they receive a $5.50 per student. You'll see some spikes down, and what that is this formula requires the county to put in their effort. Meaning you can't just tank and not have any property taxes and then expect the state to fill in the gap. So it does have there that you have to meet effort in order to be eligible for the full funding, and that county does not and historically has not. That is their choice. The CRP. The action is to incrementally increase this funding to provide eligible counties the funding equal to 110% of the statewide local revenue per student. These funds, I should have mentioned, are mainly used, they're probably about half of the funds are used for instructional teachers and their benefits, including local supplements. This is one of the allotment categories that school districts can use to provide additional funds for their salary. Small county supplemental funding is for the 28 counties, does not include city districts that are below 3,330 average daily membership. In concept, is recognizing that two things really, our funding formulas do not really provide enough funding to serve the students at in all the areas, right? If you have 500 students and you put in those formulas, you're going to get very little amount of money. So, for those districts, we provide additional funding. And also it recognizes that, you know, even if you're a small school district, you still have those fixed costs that you have to cover. I think the gentleman from Terrell County yesterday was talking about, you know, we have, you know, 6 people in our central office, but we still have to do all those state reporting. Everything is still, they are still required to do the same things as a Wake County does. Central office, this is another area that the formula that was created in 1995 consolidated a whole bunch of positions that used to be funded kind of separately, and it made $1 allotment. And then that dollar allotment was kind of increased on a base amount and then average daily membership. But in 2002, it was frozen. And so now that this allocation is kind of out of whack with, it needs to be refreshed because we have, if you compare different school districts, you'll see some school districts have increased in their student population, others have declined, and yet their central office allocation has remained pretty much constant, less reductions. So when we're looking at the appropriation, it is 0.86% of the state public school fund. Back in 2009, it was close to 1.5%. So we have seen a decline in that, and you will see that also in the amount of local funds where people have that that are supporting the central office operations. Again, you can see the difference in the range of the average daily membership, the dollars per student, from 19 to 859. Somewhere like those very small school districts are going to receive a larger dollars per student so that they can have a superintendent and a finance officer and those key personnel that everyone has to have. So it is a weighting of sorts. I think it's clear that as we go through it, that you can see that we fund school districts differently, and we fund them based on the demographics of their students. So we have all those allotments, and then they create this pool of funds, and then the school districts are required to create those programs and to meet the needs of their students. When we're looking at just those base allotments and we look at the per student allocation, you can see each one of these bars is a school district. And you can see on the left-hand side, we have the wealthier counties. And then as you move up, the average you can see also is not in the middle. It is weighted to the left. It's not really surprising when you think that our wealthier counties tend to be large. And so they are going to skew it to that side. And then with that supplemental funding and with the at-risk, et cetera, you're going to have the low wealth counties and then those small counties on the right where they get significant additional funding. So that is how it looks like on the LEA level. When we're looking at a student level, and this is really just to pull together all the stuff I just talked about, is, every student is generating that top line, right? That $6,141. And then if you're a student with special needs, then you're going to generate some more funding, LEP, et cetera. And you're going to see kind of how it creates a weighted formula, even though we are not identifying individual students with weighting. When you look at it and you kind of have a profile student and you're saying, okay, well, they're an LEP student with special needs from a low income disadvantaged family. They live in a small low wealth county. Their funding, that blue, is going to be the state funding, and then the additional federal funding on that in the orange. And so that's $19,000 for those students, as opposed to just a student without all those attributes. And the final topic, which we hear a lot about from school districts, is the budget flexibility, or I should say the allotment flexibility. When I refer to this, I'm really talking about the flexibility to use all these different state funds for a different way. So you're like, you know what, I want to use my teacher assistants and I want to use them for additional teachers in the classroom. I want to kind of reduce my reliance on TAs and have more certified employees. That's kind of and then you would move your funding from that allocation to classroom teacher, and you would be able to do that. Historically, Lynn, when I say historically, I'm talking about pre-2009 with the Great Recession, there was kind of a mix of flexibility and not. So in that case, school districts were able to transfer TA positions for K-3 teachers. They could move their textbooks into instructional supplies. They did have restrictions on certain categorical allotments and other things, but they had some flexibility. Then during the Great Recession, because of all the budget crisis, the flexibility was opened up a great deal, specifically in the categorical allotments, where school districts could move funds, almost all of them, except for exceptional children and CTE. There were limitations. We do have maintenance of effort requirements on those, so those were locked down even during that period. And then since 2015, that flexibility has been restricted. And so when we're looking at those and there is general statute that defines this. When we are looking at those flexibilities or lack of flexibilities, this is kind of what it comes down to, is Teacher positions cannot be transferred. Other positions can be transferred. They can be cashed in for dollars, but at the beginning step of the salary schedule. There can be no transfers out of exceptional children, academically and intellectually gifted allotment, or the LEP. There cannot be transfers out of textbooks or teacher assistants, or you cannot move funds into central office, which has always been a thing. And driver's education is kind of locked down. That is because it is funded not by state appropriations. It's actually funded by receipts. So that's why that is so. This is something the school districts are very interested in having back, is having that flexibility to move those funds. So in summary, that is the current funding formula with your CRPs. Aligned with the CRP. There are definitely formulas that can be improved. I would say that we do create weighting of such in our own unique North Carolina way. And that budget flexibility is an important companion to the way our funding was. Our funding is created. So with that, Chairman Davis, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Well, I think we'd all agree that is the most exciting reason, but seriously. Well done. Thank you. Questions or comments or insights or thoughts on what Ms. Schultz has shared with us? Mr. Wendell. Oh.
The performance pay for high-performing principals working in low-performing schools, up to $30,000 per year, $90,000 under a 3-year contract. Did you say that they, at that point in time, they are no longer eligible for longevity pay?
No, actually, longevity pay was removed, was incorporated into the compensation packet before the that recruitment bonus was in. They are two separate things. So principals are not eligible for longevity pay, but that was back in 2016 when they restructured the pay for principals.
Mr. Waltz.
Exactly. Cafeteria duty, you're right. Testing. Okay, just wanted you to elaborate a little bit on the why that only half of the $30,000 supplements have not been issued out statewide.
I'm actually going to defer to Dr. Emery on this, as she is out in the field kind of doing that education side of it.
Are you shirking your responsibility? You know, the answer. So I don't think there's just one answer. In fact, Alexis and I are talking about working on an exit survey or something as we wind down to the end of this money, and actually hearing from both those who opted to use the incentive and those who did not, to get a better idea. What I can tell you anecdotally is timing. So this launched right before COVID. And so you had people who were worried about other things besides recruiting a high achieving principal into a vacancy. That was one. Two, the other very common issue we have heard from across the state is that people had already taken steps to hire a new principal in the school that was designated to receive the incentive. And for the overall good of the school, they didn't want to, after 1 year, replace that person or move them around in their system because of the instability that typically happens in the turnover. So some of the question was, you know, I just moved this person here. Can this apply to them? So we do think there could be some tweaks in this language, but the language is very specific. It's very targeted to specific schools. So we didn't have a lot of flexibility other than to work through the list of those identified and then get to the what would be considered alternates. I do also just want to say, while I have the mic, one of those issues is, as Alexis talked about, ability to recruit. And so while $30,000 a year seems like a lot of money in certain parts of our state, finding people who want to move to that area even for 3 years is very challenging for them. And then just a side note, because I was going to ask to make this comment before you handed this off to me, I do want to say about flexibility, having spent most of my life in the field, we need to be really clear that lack of flexibility is an equity issue. It's a huge equity issue in the state. When you are in a large district, urban, or you are in a district with a large commercial industrial tax base or even property value tax base, your local revenue allows you flexibility, whether the statute does or not. And many of us know how we move our highest paid teachers to the top of this allotment. We hired all of our lowest paid teachers with local funds. We can be flexible with how we assign them or how we use them. Our small districts that rely completely on a state budget miss all of that. And I just think it's important that we are reminded that flexibility is clearly an equity issue.
So, Alexis, Rob, I do have a comment. First of all, I want to say this is a great presentation. I think that the more we could talk about how this impacts local districts, the better people will understand the different dynamics. As Dr. Emery has said, if you talk to superintendents from different districts, they will give you their different thoughts about this. I would say that as a superintendent from a rural, low district, geographically large district, I probably got 70% of what I wanted. That other 30% that Bev talks about is that flexibility piece. That would be great. So I only have one question for you, and probably more of a comment on the other. I'll let you decide. But I'm curious to know how much reverts back to the GA out of 01 positions, because I know that they fund that based on whatever is sent. And so we don't use all of that. I know that. And so whatever you think that number might be, if you could share that with us. And I know it changes from one year to the next. So my other question does have to do with the retirement system. And you and I have had this conversation. I think the big issue for the state and for most states is how they get out of the retirement business, because you talked about retirement in 03 or 04, that was around 3%. Now it's 23%. So we can sustain that system. And I am certainly concerned about that as someone who approaches retirement. But I think we've got to look at that differently, because a teacher can start at 21, teach for 30 years, retire at 51, and draw from the system until they're 91. So that creates a tremendous problem. What are your thoughts on how we transition to a hybrid system, and then perhaps people choosing their own system? So
I'll take the second question first.
Okay.
Which is, that's totally out of my area of expertise. It is, that's not an education question. That is a state level system question. And there are experts in that field that I would not discredit with my own response. But clearly, as I said, it's not just, North Carolina, we have 180,000 employees in education, which is clearly a big chunk. But that's a concern for the entire state, right? Is just what is the decision to move forward? The first question, give me a word that it was. I forget. It was, the reversion. Thank you. Okay, so I was like, so before I answer that, my statement was that we could talk about how we budget at the state level. So there is no expectation that we would have zero reversions. In fact, that would make many, many people very, very nervous. So the reversion, if you're talking about how how many positions do we revert out of the classroom teacher, which is 001 that he was referring to? Minimal, like 10 positions maybe. All the school districts are very good at utilizing their funds. There is very little when you're talking, you might hear, well, the state public school fund reverted $140 million. Okay, that is not from public schools. The public schools are not spending the money that they have. That's a difference between the budget and the allocations. So that's a different thing. And when you're looking at that kind of money, we're talking about 1%, right? So we're comfortable with that. And I think the General Assembly is too. It's not like they're like, oh my gosh, this is crazy. I mean, so it is a very, very important distinction, the budget versus the allocations versus the expenditures.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I wanted to just comment on your second question, Dr. Taylor. So one of the perks of my role is that I get to sit on the board for TSERS, the Teachers State Retirement Plan. And we actually met very recently. And one of the things that I think is important to realize as we contemplate, some of us, the answer to your question, Dr. Taylor, about should we stay in the retirement business the way we have, or should we just give teachers the money that goes into the teacher retirement system as most other states have? So I frequently hear people say we lose teachers to Virginia. Virginia doesn't have a state teacher retirement system anymore. And so we get just as many teachers back as leave. I would, for those of you who are kind of, lost about this conversation, slide 29 is absolutely astounding, Alexis, that in 2005, 22% of the benefits as a percentage of salary has gone now to 39%. We have one of the top 5, if not the best funded pensions in the entire country. And so, Dr. Taylor, your pension is safe. However, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be thinking about whether or not to continue as we have. But I will say that is an incredibly complicated and controversial conversation to have, and certainly not one for today. But it is something that we should all, as educators, be aware of.
And I would add, we have a member of our board, the treasurer, who would have interest in this conversation. So when he's able to participate, it'd be great. Mr. Coltrane.
I just wanted to come back to the flexibility point that Dr. Taylor and Dr. Emery were raising. And I know that was part of the equity conversation this morning with the Ed Trust. And it's also an action in the CRP. Do you know how many allotments have lost flexibility since the ABC transfer system was first put in place? So what kind of flexibility loss we're talking about over the last 20 some years?
Yeah, so, and the ABC system was when the accountability system came in, and part of the concept of that was that there is an accountability system, and with that flexibility, right? Or rather the other way around, there's flexibility with accountability, right? So I could not do that off the top of my head because of the change that went when the ABC system came into play. And that was in the mid 90s, I believe. And then during the recession era where it was kind of changed. And then it's been, there was kind of an additional restriction each year, kind of in the 2016-17 timeframe, where it was like one year it was like a lockdown on LEP, and then the next year was AIG, and then textbooks. And so it's been kind of an incremental. I'd have to go back and do the comparison.
Chemnitz.
Alexis, do you have any sense with how the caps to EC and AIG and LEP, how they impact the impact across the state? How many districts routinely go over those, have students have more students than the cap allows, and so then have to cover those costs themselves? Do you have any sense of the scope of that across the state?
It is, I do know for EC, I don't have the exact number, but I would say it's over half. It's kind of probably in the more 80 of them, I would think. But on the second statement, I would say it's not, it's hard to say that because they've gone over their incurring costs, right? They still have that pool of funds. It's just that they don't have that full, arguably arbitrary number of 4,550 this past year, kind of for that one headcount. And keeping in mind the headcount was actually from the prior year anyway, so it's not, I'm certainly not stating that the cap should be gone. I'm just making sure that we keep in the concept of what that allocation is as it is right now in line D.
Ms. Thomas.
I think we on, I think it's probably about 50-60%. I think we've had some drops. Interestingly, some of our very large districts are well under that cap of 12.75, which is also fascinating to me. What we are seeing and what we have seen in the last 10 to 15 years is that districts could cover that high needs kid because they had enough of their population with low need services. Those kids are the ones leaving to go to private, to go to charter, to go somewhere else. So districts are now sitting with those really high needs kids with less funding, and it's getting harder to stretch those dollars, which is why we, back in 15 and 16, did that study with some internal folks, and it proposed many times to our friends back here, a study to look at that tiered level of funding. Many states have gone to that. And it is a much more equitable way to serve these students because we've got kiddos out there that have a nurse, that have a one-on-one, that have OT and PT and speech, and are in a self-contained classroom, and they're getting that $4,500 for that student, just like Alexis, who goes for 30 minutes for reading 3 days a week. So that balance is not there to cover anymore.
I would think that the cap for LEP would be increasingly problematic as that population percentage rises across the state. Is that a fair assumption?
That would be how the trend is, and I'd be happy to get you those numbers for this current year, or maybe going back to 2019 when we had good numbers, and provide that to you. Yeah.
Ms. Clemens.
So good afternoon. So you talked a lot in a couple of slides about the formulas, specifically the ones that I'm interested in is with looking at teacher assistants, looking at counselors, looking at APs. Who develop those formulas, and what data or information that we have to show that it's adequate numbers. Just being in the field, I see the negative impact of not having enough teacher assistants, not having enough personnel to do the work and to, meet the needs of our students. So just curious about how those formulas are created and how do we know that they're adequate?
Yeah, I think so with those base formulas, many of them go back to the basic education program, which was legislation, which basically, took, okay, we've got this elementary school, what resources do you need in an elementary school? And then setting up those resources to educate all those students and then developing the cost from that, right? So, and that now is way back, but many of those funding formulas still continue. Specifically on the teacher assistants, I believe that is actually the $2,015 per student, right, is how that is from that era. When they changed it in 2015, it wasn't really looking at, you can see from the formula itself, it kind of has one teacher assistant for every 2 classes in kindergarten and one teacher. So it develops sort of this teacher assistant ratio for the classrooms. It's more associated with what the General Assembly was funding. I mean, I think it's more transparent in a way when you're looking at it, how that was. With regards to the other ratios, the assistant principal, I can't say that where that goes back to, whether it does go back to the BEP or, and the same thing with the instructional support. I will say that, you know, where that has been, there has been changes in the ratio over time. And so, specifically when we had the recession, there were cuts to those resources. The teacher assistant allotment category has been reduced significantly.
Any other questions or comments? Mr. McKinney.
Well, I think the most, I mean, and I'm trying not to, you know, I'm certainly not going to talk about the adequacy and what is adequate and all that kind of thing, right? So that aside, I think from a school district's perspective, the pain point is the exceptional children's allocation. That is something that is always brought up. So I would definitely put that on the list. I think from the central office, that being, that's one that I think could be, it's not a huge amount of money and could be fixed relatively, even if it wasn't additional money, it could be recalibrated. And then the LEP, which some of that is, so, you know, some of these are General Assembly, like legislative formulas, and then some of them are state board, but some of them are a combination of two. Like the LEP is kind of a combination of the two. You know, when we're looking at the, and simplifying things, you know, when you're combining the at-risk and DSSF, it's kind of like, why wouldn't we, right? We can do that as a state relatively easily. And when you're combining textbooks and instructional supplies, especially with the digital age, why wouldn't we? You know, there are some pretty, in my opinion, some very easy things that could be done. And then, of course, with the exceptional children, that's a pretty big undertaking, but a lot of work has been done, as Sherry can attest. I mean, there was a lot of input from school districts and experts in that field. So, so pretty much everything that I just said, everything on the CRP would be fine with, yeah. So,
Anything else? Just building on Mr. McKinney's final point, of all the areas that will either enable or inhibit our ability to achieve our strategic plan, this ranks right up there with human capital. And frankly, ahead of literacy, because literacy depends on. So what we really need is our best minds. We can identify the problems. We need our best minds working in a working group, come up with potential solutions. And we need that relatively quickly, at least before the next long session. Because this will, the solutions we come up with will address the issues we all see today, that our state has outgrown our current, in many ways, our current systems, as well as addressing the equity issues that we're all aware of. So I guess I'd look to the superintendent, perhaps in your Polaris approach, or however you see as best operationalized, is to figure out how to pull the best minds of the agency together to give us some ideas around how to address these. Okay. Okay, great. Thank you, Ms. Schaus. Okay, our next presentation provides us an opportunity to look at data and policies and strategies to ensure equitable access and outcomes. And at this time, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Imoa Iruka to our meeting.
All right, can you hear me? Perfect, thank you. Thank you, Chairman, for welcoming me. I appreciate it. And that was a rousing presentation. Anything about money is always a rousing presentation. So I was glad to be able to hear that. So again, I am Ioma Iruka, and I'm a research professor in public policy and also a fellow at Frank Porter Graham Child Development Institute, and also the founder and director of the Equity Research Action Coalition, all at UNC Chapel Hill. So thank you all for welcoming me to your planning meeting. And so I'll be with you for a little bit because I actually have to run to another meeting with the census. So I apologize in advance of that. So thank you again. So just to give you a sense of, make sure my thing is going. Is the clicker working? I don't see it working. It's not actually, maybe the battery's dead. Hold on. Hold on. I see the battery lighting up. If not, I'll just use the side. It's okay. It's not turning. Technology only works sometimes. Perfect. Thank you. All right. So just quickly, what is the Equity Research Action Coalition? So University Collaborative at the Frank Porter Graham. For those who don't know, the Frank Porter Graham is actually one of the oldest institutions that did one of the seminal studies around what is the importance of early childhood education, called the Abecedarian Study. And so this coalition is founded under that institute. And what we're doing with the coalition is that we're focused on co-constructing actionable research and evaluation with practitioners, policymakers such as yourselves, really in support of optimizing the learning and the development and health of children, particularly Black children, Latino children, other children of color. And we really work at the intersection of both research, practice, and policy using what I call an anti-racist, but really a cultural wealth framework. So what I hope to do with this session here, at least as part of this session, is to highlight disparities, but really with attention to what could we do, right? Because it's one thing to talk about all the disparities, but what are some of the solutions? And sort of in light of is it Ms. Shack? I can't remember her name, right? Talking about sort of the different formula models. What is it that we can do to really ensure equitable access, but also the experiences, right? Because you can go to a school building, but is that going to be a healthy, thriving, enriching environment, right? And then what are the outcomes that we want for all our children, whether you're, special education, whether you're a dual language learner, et cetera. And then really, hopefully, I hope to sort of capture your interest in terms of identifying avenues to advance equity, really through systematic and also looking at health equity as well. Because in the end of it, children cannot learn well if they're not healthy. This is really what we know so far in our science. And also we have to identify policies and strategies that ensure equitable access. So my take-home message, because in case I leave you a little earlier, I want us to just go beyond sort of just the gap gazing. And I feel like just being in this this last session, clearly you're doing more than that. You're clearly thinking about finances. You're clearly thinking about how do you improve, school, functioning, human capital. So I think that's important. But we also have to uncover the races and the systemic inequities that actually exist in the roots of our educational system. But that means that we have to think about access. We have to think about experiences and outcomes. And I think as this meeting has called for, you're going to think about how do we also improve equity as part of the central point to dismantle racism in our education institutions. And of course, you can't fix everything in 1 year. You're not going to fix it with one plan. but you can be on a journey to continue to improve upon it so that all children really do have access to what is education, the strategy to ensure children are able to thrive from the time that they're born to the time that obviously, hopefully they die, right? So I'm a statistician, so there's always going to be data. So here is one data, and I'll tell you exactly what it says. So first, I'm going to walk you through the reading part, which is the left-hand side for those who can see the board. And then the last side is the math. So these are outcomes from our national data, from the U.S. Department of Education data, the Early Child Longitudinal Study Kindergarten Cohort. And so what this shows you is what is the gap between Black children and white children, the gap between Latino children and white children, the gap between Asian children and white children. And so this is really the gap when children enter kindergarten in the fall, and then the darker color is when they enter in the spring of kindergarten and then the spring of first grade. And I want to sort of just highlight a few things. One is, if you can see, right, so you have the Black children on the end and the Latino children, we can see that there's a disparity, a little bit of a disparity in reading between Black children and white children. This is above and beyond income. I know the idea that income is sort of the issue, poverty is the issue. Yeah, of course, poverty is a problem. As somebody who grew up in poverty, yes, I did not want to grow up in poverty, right? But it's not the only problem. And this data shows that when we control for poverty, we control for maternity education, that we do still have a slight, a racial gap in our reading. So for Black children, it's not as big. We're talking about maybe about a month or two behind when they enter kindergarten. And so it grows as they stay in elementary school. So it grows in kindergarten, it grows in first grade. And our Latino children, we do see that the gap is much larger. And it's really probably because of their language, right? The language issue, right? But the gap is still there. But it's the opposite for our Asian children. And then for our children called other, that's really your Native American, your multiracial, et cetera. And so there's still a gap of some sort, right? So this is your reading. In the math, you see it's even bigger. This is, to me, one of the big problems, right? If that we can address some reading, but math is really the higher order cognitive thinking, and a lot happens in math. So we do see a huge gap when Black children, Latino children enter kindergarten, and it continues to sort of really actually expand even much more for Black children. We don't see the same problem with our Asian children, but you can see that is reducing over time. And then our other children, quote unquote, our Native Americans, our multiracial children. And I want you to look at this, not to say that there's something wrong with our Black children, there's something wrong with our Latino children, right? Or something that's better, right? But is that there are things at work that create these disparities. And it happens before children actually enter your system, right? Your formalized system, your K-3 system, your K to elementary school. So there's something to recognize that a lot of it's happening. A lot of things happen before children are born, actually. And some of that continues as they enter your school system. So that's something important that I hope you see from this. And then this other data, I won't go too much into it, but this is executive function. So for those, that's not on the state assessment, I know, but executive function is something important. Your executive function skills are basically your regulatory skills, right? So imagine a child who's having to say, okay, do I get up and do something, or do I sit in my chair and listen to Miss Smith? Right? They have to regulate their behavior. And we do see a huge gap between our Black children, Latino children, and our white children. Again, I will caution some of these assessments are not as appropriate, I would argue, for our Black and Latino children, but nevertheless, it just shows there are some differences significantly between our minoritized children, particularly our Black and Latino, compared to our white children. Again, we have to recognize that some of this is not because of children and their abilities and skills, but there are other things that work that I think as an education institution, you must attend to. So this is why I sort of say, let's take a look at from the health perspective, right? Because to me, the health perspective gives you a much larger frame. So because at the end of it, learning is health, right? I think this idea that education is different than public health is one that has not, is not a good lens. I think if we can combine public health and education, I think that's much stronger. So if we look at sort of this figure, this is from the Centers for Disease Control. And you can see basically what it tells you, that there are structural things that are at play, which is there are policies, right? So your funding formulas, as somebody asked earlier, your funding formulas, how you decide to allocate funding, how you decide to sort of say who's a teacher versus an assistant teacher, right? All the different sort of folks, whatever policies you make around your funding has implications for the kind of experiences that children are going to have in your schools and in your classrooms, right? And so this is where the structure you create really impacts children later on. It impacts the staff, it impacts the schools, it impacts the communities, which then impacts the children, right? So I think when we think about sort of schools, we think about, oh, I just open up a school building, I just go. But we know it's so much more than that. And from a public health standpoint, we have to recognize that schools are part of a community. And if a community is not strong, is not healthy writ large, if there's a lot of challenges, that is actually going to impact the family and it's going to actually impact the children. So from a public health perspective, we have to think of schools as a place of healing, a place of learning. But if we don't have that larger health, that larger health framing, then we can just miss the boat. So again, I sort of encourage you all to think about, how do you think about schools as a healing place, right? It's a learning place, but it could also be a healing place. And so, of course, we know at least from my national data, so it was good to actually see North Carolina's sort of data. We do see that there is a disparity in terms of equitable access, in terms of equitable funding, that we do know that a lot of schools where there are mostly non-white districts, we do see there's a lower sort of pay per, at least amount per student. What we can see that the formula here may be adjusted. So again, take into account what is the formula for non-white districts who also happen to also be many districts with children of color, children with special education, children who speak are not native English speakers. So again, think about those sort of things as well. So we do see this in our national data. And I think you probably got a presentation from somebody from EdBuild about that. We also think about issues of access to special education. This one is really important. And I'm glad that there was a discussion around sort of that SPED funding. And because we do know that in particular, Black and Latino children are less likely to actually access special education in kindergarten. They're likely to get it after. We also see this with our early intervention. A lot of our kids of color do not get access to early intervention early enough, right? Number one, they don't get it early enough. When they get it, it's not of good quality. And so as you think about your special education resources, think about not just do they get access to it, but is it good enough? Is the services good enough? We're finding the services not even good enough. They don't even match their IEPs. The parents don't even know they have an IEP, right? So they're not part of the meetings that's happening. So we have to think about the SPED issue and how early are children with special education getting access. And then discipline disparities. I mean, I don't know if this was on the agenda for this planning session, but it's clear it's one of the national conversations we're having, particularly in our early child programming. And obviously, as the federal dollars comes down, more money will come into the state for more Head Start funding, more childcare, but also more public pre-K money. But we do see that in early childhood, we do see a disproportionality when it concerns, suspension expulsion. Now, yes, granted, you know what? Young 36-month-olds, 40-month-olds, yes, they would be disruptive. If you have kids, you understand, yes, they could be disruptive. But the fact that we see that, Black children make up 18% of the enrollment in early education, but make up almost 50% of suspension expulsion. It is not because they have bigger challenging problems, because of how they're seen. So we do have disproportionality issues we have to think about. That means that we have to support not addressing children, but adults. Are the adults fully supported? Are their stresses being supported? Their mental health? Is there funding, right, to address any of their emotional health? So again, the discipline disparity is something that we have to continue to pay attention to. In North Carolina, we actually have one of the biggest sort of disparities when it concerns discipline. The same thing for children who both have a IEP, we do see disparities also in children who do have IEPs, right? Especially our Black children, our Native children who have IEPs, that they're likely to be suspended, our boys as well as our girls, right? So this is the issue of people think it's just a boy issue. No, it's also a girl issue. It's actually just a child issue in terms of suspension. So especially for children with disability. And then our use of mechanical restraints. So think about it. If you have a child who is 6 years old, right, who may be having some challenges that day, the fact that we are likely to restrain Black children, Native children, Latino children when they have challenges, especially when they have a disability that's probably not fully serviced, is something that we should think about, because that's actually causing harm, right? As a parent of a 5-year-old and an 8-year-old here in the States, right, I would never want to imagine that my child would be physically restrained in a way that's not healthy, and it's actually harmful for their social emotional well-being, right? So it could create more trauma. And that's what we don't want schools to do, is create more trauma. And so finally, I want us to look at what are the outcomes that we're measuring. Again, I'm not suggesting that the outcomes for North Carolina is not good enough, but I am saying, are there other things that we have to capture around children of color? For example, we do know that children who speak a different language actually have good linguistic skills. Imagine if you had to speak 2 languages and you're like 4 years old, and you go into a classroom that's probably, everybody speaks mostly English, and you're having to convert and translate your home language with the English language and go back and forth all day. That is a lot of work. That is a cognitive ability that many of us people, cannot do well. Like imagine that you're a 4-year-old, you're a 6-year-old, and you're having to translate your language in your head and push it out and write it out. That is a lot of work. And that's a cognitive flexibility. That is a skill that we actually don't measure. We actually see kids who speak a different language as less than, but that is not true. It's actually a great thing, right? Many global societies actually speak like 5 languages. We got only 1. So again, it's not to say poo-poo America, but it is to say that, multiple language is actually a great thing that we should begin to measure. For our Black children, for example, we do see that they actually have strong oral language. We actually don't measure that. And you know what it is? It's because they know how to story tell. Now you may ask them, okay, Sammy, what's an apple? Now they could say it's a fruit and it grows on a tree. But no, some kids are like, well, you know what? When I went to my mama's vacation, we had to go out there in the field, and they tell you a whole story, but they eventually get to the fruit. But it takes them a whole journey. But that's because they have these strong oral narrative, strong skills in storytelling, because they have a vivid imagination. But we don't have time to hear your stories or everything about you, Sammy. And that's something that we have to figure out, is how do we assess the assets that children have in the way that we actually collect data, right? So that's another thing to measure. And then the other part is the social emotional part, right? I think COVID-19 has shown us that, right? Children are brilliant people, right? They're scientists in many ways. They can really, they're resilient. So I think about my kids, we were in the Zoom world for 1.5 years. Now imagine I told my kids, no, you cannot use your iPad. No, you can never be on the screen. And next minute, they had to be on the screen. They had to learn how to mute. They had to learn how to do work online that they never, ever had to be exposed to. But they figured that out. That is called social emotional skills. That is executive function skills. That is self-regulation. And we don't measure that. We're talking about learning loss. Yes, they maybe missed a few things on the test. Yeah, probably. But there's so much that they gained. They probably gained a new knowledge about how my iPad works. They gained a new knowledge about what their parents do, what their nanny does, right? What does it mean, right? So they probably get all the kind of knowledge about their community. So how do we look at these other assets that children bring in our assessments? A lot of times they capture all the things that Black children can do, all the things that Latino children can do. How do we capture the things that they can do? Their social emotional, their ability to really find joy in the smallest of things, right? So what do we do about inequities, right? So I, me and colleagues produced a report, particularly for early childhood, because we understand that, K-12 is important, but our evidence indicates that education starts way before kids enter your building. It starts actually before they're born. And so we thought that, we need to start with equity as early as possible. And unfortunately, early childhood also has racist roots that we are trying to also help to address through this report. So this report was in partnerships with Education Trust, the National Indian Child Care Association, NBCDI, the National Black Child Development Institute, the Council for Professional Recognition, NAYC. So these are the national players in early childhood. And so through that partnership, we developed a report about how do we get to equitable learning systems, right? So this is part of our solution, right? We don't want to just say, oh my goodness, everything sucks. We want to at least give you some ideas, hopefully, right? So we said, okay, we need to attend to access to resources, opportunities, experiences, right? And that we have to actively and continuously identify and intentionally eliminate the manifestation of systemic racism. We know racism exists. This is not a new concept. We've seen it in public health forever and ever. We see it everywhere. So the job of this report is to really elucidate what could we do. So we decided to do 14 policies that we think really can be done today. It doesn't require new legislation, either in the State House or either in Congress, but these are things that can be done. And I'm hoping it's also helpful for the school board, right? Even though this is for the early childhood community, we think this is very much relevant for K-12 public education. They go through equitable funding, which we just heard about, right? Integration, monitoring. So I'll just go through a couple of them, but I do want to highlight that really we talk about, we need to have equitable funding. It's not, I mean, I think the formula sort of talked about it. Yes, you can't give money to the same people, the same amount, the same way. You have to look at the context, what's needed, the children, the families, the communities, whether you're rural versus urban, right? Right. So whether you're low wealth versus, you know, your higher wealth. So, right. And I think that's why it's number one, because if you don't have money, you can't do much, right? So I won't talk about all 14, but I will talk about a couple of them. So one is addressing workforce equity, right? And this is one, I think, as highlighted in the previous presentation, that the workforce is really the beat, the heart of every school system. This is how children experience the school, is through the teachers. And so being able to make sure that our teachers are fully valued. So in early childhood, we're actually saying that we have to increase, at least for early childhood, the value of subsidies. So that means that in some ways, you have to think about how do you pay your teachers more? And not just your teachers, but your assistant teachers. We have discovered that many of our Latino teachers, our bilingual teachers that we actually need, our Black teachers, a lot of them are sitting in the assistant teacher pool. We actually have to make sure that, because they're doing a lot of work, they're making that connection between the home, the family, the community, and the school. And so we have to recognize that being an assistant teacher is not just you're holding the books. For the teachers, you're doing a lot of work as well. So how do we make sure that we are efficiently paying them in a way that compensates them for their value that's beyond just being in the classroom, but being that conduit between family, community, and schools? And then we also say that part of states, you have to attract and develop plans to address racial disparities in compensation. So I guess I also ask you all to think about, are there disparities in your workforce in terms of how you're paying it? Are you seeing disparities in sort of those who are making more versus not, right? And that's something that would take some attention to, right? Are you paying equitably your teachers, particularly your teachers of color, particularly your teachers who are bilingual, because that is a hard job as well. And of course, your workforce preparation, right? The idea is that we have to, obviously we have a whole task force around sort of workforce preparation and diversifying the workforce, but we think about how we actually train our workforce. I mean, I will argue, as somebody who does work around racial, equity, racial disparities, that we do have to make sure that our workforce understand the roots of systemic inequities. You cannot continue coming into classrooms and not realize that you're probably causing harm, whether intentional or not unintentional. It actually doesn't matter. If it happens, it's still bad. Right? When you run over somebody and said, oops, I didn't mean to hit you, you still hit me, right? And so I think we have to recognize that. That's not bluster, it's not about intentionality. It's about, we want to make sure that our youngest people, our children, our citizens are protected at all costs. And to me, by not recognizing the roots of inequities that we are in some ways perpetuating in our books, in our words, in our actions, and even in our lack of resources. And so we have to make sure we expand the literacy of all those the teachers, but also those who work with our teachers, right? We have a lot of professional development actors. We have a lot of people who are supporting teachers. We also have to make sure that they also understand that if you're trying to really meet the needs of all children, you have to understand the system that you're part of and how are you part of ensuring equity throughout that whole process. And of course, our curriculum, right? I mean, look, I'm just here to give you my research and give you my thoughts, so y'all could debate that. But our curriculum is one that's important. This is the conduit that we teach children. And our research indicates that many of our children of color, our Native children, our Black children, our Latino children, our Asian children do not see themselves in the curriculum. Imagine you sitting in your classroom and say, oh my goodness, this is great literature, this is great, but I don't see anything that I can connect with. I'm doing science, I'm doing math, but I don't see anything I can link with. If you want our children to stay in our schools, they have to feel like they're connected, they have to be engaged. That is the one marker of actually educational success, is how engaged am I in this lecture? If you're not engaged, you're like, whatever, thank you for giving me your teaching, teacher, but I'm checked out. And if it's not engaged, and if our curriculum is not connected to children, how do we expect them to really learn and lean into it? We want children to lean into learning, right? I love that my kids love school because what they see of themselves is in the books, is on the walls, is everywhere, because it's connected to them. And our job as educators is not about us as adults, it's about what do children need to learn. And we know that they need to see themselves, their experiences, their family, their community in the textbooks. They need to see it in the classroom, in the walls. They need to hear it and feel it. And by not doing that, we're not giving them the best of what I consider equitable education. So we have to make sure that we're providing funding to make sure that we are providing culturally, linguistically, and affirming curriculum and pedagogy. And then finally, I think we have to think about how do we eliminate harsh discipline. Yes, I'm going to keep saying, my mother's a teacher in Boston, Public School teacher, right? And I could say many of my friends are teachers. And I know I don't know if it's a hard job. I know I kind of know because I spent a whole year and a half with my kids, with myself and my husband, and it was torture. It was hard. It was really, it was really hard. It was really, really hard. But it made me even appreciate my teachers. I loved my teachers, but it gave me even deeper appreciation because I had two. I only had two. I didn't have 30. I didn't have 35. I had two and a husband. So it was 1-on-1 ratio, and we were terrible. And so I can understand that, some kids are challenging, and you're like, look, I got 29 other kids that I have to deal with. But I argue that part of our job is how do we make sure that we are not suspending and disciplining children in a harsh way that's actually ineffective. We're good at punishment. We're not actually good at healing or repairing. So how do we eliminate harsh discipline? So that means that we have to provide, not addressing children's problems, we have to address adult problems, right? Suspension exposure is not a child issue. It's actually an adult issue from our data. And so how do we provide resources? How do you provide resources to sort of prohibit that? And also collect data to track that, right? You can't fix something if you don't see it, right? And we know from all of our national data and even our North Carolina data that we do have issues with suspension expulsion, particularly children of color, especially Black children. And so we have to address that. Why are we kicking children out who you believe need education the most, right? You need it the most, but I'm going to throw you out the most, right? That's actually contradictory to our philosophy. And then, of course, I already said early intervention, special education, right? We know for a fact that many, we have a sort of infant mortality, not mortality, but we have issues in terms of preterm birth, labor disparities in that, and also in low birth weight. And low birth weight actually, predisposes you to actually cognitive challenges, also behavioral challenges, because that's what it does. That's what pre-birth and low birth weight. But so does lead and other sort of environmental toxins. So this is where public health comes into mind. When kids are exposed to, chemical toxins, when they're exposed to lead, when they're exposed to just a lot of community sort of toxicants, it actually impacts their brain development. And it also impacts their ability to self-regulate. But that means that they should get access to special education and early intervention early. But a lot of our kids are not getting that. So we have to make sure that we have enough funding in that pool to make sure that schools are not capping who gets special education, who gets early intervention as well. So that's something to think through is, are we having enough money? And then similarly for our dual language learners, I think the number said from 100,000 to now 125,000 is bigger. There's some dual language learners who are actually never considered dual language learners. So the numbers are actually, I think, understated. But that means that we have to make sure that we have the resources to support our children whose first language is not English, but also the teachers. We have seen even from Florida all the way to Texas and even in California, they don't have teachers for teaching children who are dual language learners. We need bilingual teachers. That means we have to think about what's the cost of recruitment, retention as well for bilingual learners. So with that, I just want to say in the end of it that I hope as you think about your plan and about equity, about Leandro, right, that there's a recognition that early childhood is really, really important. But it's not a panacea. Education is not a panacea for all of society's problem. It is a good, important strategy, but in of itself, it actually has not solved everything, but it is an important space. And they don't work in isolation. We have to think about public health as well. Think about other resources, other supports that's both in the building, but also outside the building. And we must address other inequities, I argue, from wealth generation, healthcare, climate, immigration. These are really connected to children and connected to schools and how schools function. So with that, I'm going to give you my take home again, which is, continue to move beyond the gap gaze. And we see a lot of states or local governments sort of look at, oh my God, the disparities, it must be the kids. We need to fix the kids. It's not the kids. It's the adults. We make the decisions. We hold the purse strings. We get to decide who needs it the most. What should we do? We are the purse string, right? And we have to continue to uncover how racism is part of our educational system. We have to begin to figure out how do we make sure that our formulas, right? Good intentions, sometimes they may not be working as well as they can be to make education available for all that need it. And we have to think about the access, right? What kind of access are we given in terms of equitable educational access, right? Whether it's due to language, special education, and other sort of factors. And what are the actual experiences, right? If you're suspending me, if you're throwing me out, if the curriculum is not fitting who I am, is not engaging me, am I providing the best access that I can, right? We can't create a system that only works for some as opposed to all. And then, of course, continue to center equity, right? And especially in our education institutions. Education was created to sort of give support, but we have to continue to change it and transform it to 21st century, right? We can't sort of continue to use 18th century sort of modeling for 21st century, right? We're the United States of America. We should be thinking much more boldly, much more transformatively, not like, let me use the formula, let me use the process, let me use the curriculum for 30, 40, 50 years ago for today. Today is different, right? We are still in a pandemic, right? And so I think, how do we think forward thinking? And of course, I say continue to sort of do the work that you do. I appreciate each and every one of you for doing the work that you do. You're in this room, figuring out budgets, curriculum, how to make sure that you have, a system that works for everybody across the state, right? So I say continue to be on a journey. I hope that you're really focused on the equity issue, right? It's not about equality. We passed equality decades ago. So that to me is not even a language, but it's how do you create equity in your educational system? How do we do that, right? My kids are in the system, so I have a personal relationship with the system, right? I need it to be equitable. But not just for my kids. I think they'll be fine. But I need it to be equitable for those who look like my kids, those who don't look like my kids, those who are growing up in poverty, those who are homeless, those who go home hungry. Like, how do we create a system that works for them? So with that, I say thank you for allowing me to share a few things. Feel free to, if you have questions or comments or thoughts. But of course, we have a lot of work that we're doing around combating racism in early childhood and education, and in other public health policies, because in the end of it, this is what I need to do. This is part of, we have to commit to equity in many ways because our children's future depends on it. And so I thank you for allowing me to speak with you all today.
Questions or comments from my colleagues?
It's one thing to deliver a message. It's another thing to have the passion that comes with it, that allows the audience to be able to get into your world and what you're trying to say and trying to do. And as an educator, and my undergraduate was early childhood, I know we have got to put focus on early childhood education. We just have to, because if they have that beginning, they're then going to be able to just move right through the school system. So I appreciate your passion. I appreciate your message. And I just appreciate you for what you've been able to offer to us today. So thank you for being here.
Thank you for your comment. I appreciate that.
If I may.
Mr. Keenan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to say, reiterate what we just said, but there's not too many speeches that give me chills. But when you talk, I had chills because I saw that you believed in it. I saw that you care. And I just want to commend you for the effort. A lot of good information. And another, I never understood how we could go to the moon. We can send billions of dollars to other countries, but we can't help our kids in the early part of life. Like I said, when you're in the house, you got a budget. You buy what you want to buy. So the essence of my saying is, sometimes they don't want to do what needs to be done. I say take care of home before you go taking care of things away from home. Again, thank you for your comments. I will contact you later.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, that's true. I mean, that's why I say America is a country, of a lot of things. So I believe we can conquer this, and we just have to come together really as a coalition, right, and build that. So thank you for that comment.
Dr. Howard.
Thank you, Chairman. And I may be acknowledging my ignorance, but I appreciate learning. So I've never heard the term gap gazing before. And so just want to know if you would address that briefly.
I'm glad. Thank you for that question. So what we typically see is that, especially in our child development research world, there's attention to all the disparities, right? You can, there's a whole world of let's look at all the achievement gap. Let's look at sort of the wealth disparities. Let's look at the housing. Let's just look at disparities all the time. And all you do is literally look at it, but never do something about it, right? So that's the distinction that a lot of people do, the sort of let me tell you everything that's wrong in schools. Let me say everything that's wrong in America, right? But yeah, tell me that, that's fine. I think that's important. But then what are we going to do? So it's really trying to say, let's go beyond the gap gazing to one that says, what are we going to do? Even if it's not going to change everything right away, but what do we do? And to me, that's the point that we have to continue to focus on is yes, we can fight about everything, but what do we do, right, to create equity and access for all children? So thank you for that question.
Really big questions. I know you have to depart. So thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us. I want to offer a potential rebuttal and allow you to engage in the response. Is that okay?
That is perfect.
All right. So to the point of gap gazing, If we were to look at those gaps, the preponderance of data, and engage in a root cause analysis, right? And what if I reach the conclusion that, yeah, you know, those disparities exist, but there are more matters. I'm going to disagree with your argument and say that it's more matters of personal responsibility. It's more matters of families not valuing education, not adopting healthy educational cultural practices. What would your rebuttal to that be?
So we have countless data, right, that indicates that, say, let's take Black families, for example, right, that Black families, you know, it's their personal decision to sort of not work, to not read to their children. But that's not what the data shows. It actually shows the complete opposites, right? We can talk about from the 1960s. Black families were likely to say, you know what, we want you to graduate college at a higher number than even white families. They're likely to say, they actually are likely to work, actually be employed, but where they work and how much they make is the problem, right? So it's not, so in the end of it, if you think about personal responsibilities, the issue is that they actually are more likely to want education, more likely to read, more likely to go to school, do all these things. The issue is that they don't confer the same benefits, right? Sandy Darity right here at Duke talks about how, you know, you can have the same amount of education between Black and white people, but they never confer the same benefits in terms of income, in terms of wealth. This is part of the problem, is that don't tell me to go to school. Don't tell me to get a whole bunch of school degree and then I can't get a job. Or if I get a job, I'm actually being paid at least 30% less than somebody who makes the same amount of money. I'll give you another example. In early childhood, for example, we have teachers, we have racial wages, and just this is our early childhood teachers. There's $1.71 difference between a Black teacher and a white teacher for the same exact job. That is about $8,000. Now you're thinking, $8,000, what is that? It's a whole daggone money, right? So in the end of it, while yes, there are some exceptions where yes, there are some personal individual issues, but a lot of them is like, in the end of it, many families of color, those living in poverty, are working. Right? They want their kids to go to school. They're doing everything they can. But in the end of it, the system is already created to not work. You actually have to work hard. Like, I got a PhD. And trust me, it wasn't easy. I mean, everybody who got one, I know it's not easy, but it's another level of working hard, right, that we have to overcome when you're a person of color, a person who's an immigrant, a person whose first language is not English. So I think we have to kind of be careful to not make the assumption that, oh, the individual is laying at home. They're not. My mother worked 3 jobs and we still lived in the projects in Boston. So for me, some people say personal, it's not a personal, it really is a system. And we see that all the time. That's why in the end of it, the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, they say that's why they call it structured determinants, because it determines your outcomes. Because our systems, our policies, they have been instituted before I was born. And so I think your question is an important one. And so I appreciate that. But I would say in the end of it, the individual stuff is really an exception to the rule of the system drives a lot of our outcomes. Right. And so we have to recognize that. So this is a public, to me, this issue of health disparities, education disparities, it's a structural thing. It's not about an individual who made a decision. You know what? I'm not going to go to work. No, they go to work. They just don't make money.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Would you join me in thanking Dr. Rupa?
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, team, before we engage in our next presentation, let's take a 10-minute break. Let's be back at 3:10.
Oh, thank you.
So much. There's a little pack inside as well.
Oh, look at that. Thank you. Oh, thank you. Oh, my God.